Hello, loves. Today's story is The Snow Queen, which is a Hans Christian Andersen story. And this one has lots of pretty illustrations. The Snow Queen in 7 parts. Part the first, which treats of the mirror and its fragments. Listen. We are beginning our story. When we get to the end of it, we shall, it is to be hoped, know more than we do now. There was once a magician, a wicked magician, a most wicked magician. Great was his delight at having designed a mirror possessing a very special magic power, which was this. Anything good and beautiful reflected in it shrank to next to nothing, while everything ugly and useless was magnified, and made to appear 10 times worse than it did before. The loveliest landscapes viewed through this mirror looked like boiled spinach, and the handsomest people would become quite odious, or were turned upside down on their heads. Their features would be so distorted that their friends couldn't recognize them, and you could be sure that if you had a freckle, it would seem to spread all over your nose and your mouth as well. What's more, if a good or kind thought passed through anyone's mind, the mirror would reproduce it as an ugly wrinkle. All this the magician thought highly entertaining, and he chuckled with glee at his clever invention. Pupils at the school of magic where he taught spread abroad the fame of this wonderful mirror, and declared that now, for the first time in the world and its inhabitants might be seen as they really are. They carried the mirror from place to place, till at last there was no country or person that had not been misrepresented in it. Its admirers then tried to take it up to heaven to see if they could carry on their sport there. But the higher they flew, the more wrinkled the mirror became, and they had trouble holding it together. Yet still they flew on, higher and higher, till at last the mirror trembled so fearfully that it escaped from their hands and fell to the earth, shattering into millions, billions, and trillions of tiny pieces. And then it caused even greater unhappiness than before, for all those pieces of glass, scarcely so large as a grain of sand, flew about in the air and got into people's eyes, causing them to view everything the wrong way, or notice only what was bad and corrupt, each little fragment having retained the peculiar properties of the entire mirror. Some people were unlucky enough to get a little splinter in their hearts, and that was terrible because the heart became cold and hard, like a lump of ice. Some pieces were large enough to be used as window panes, but it was a no good idea to look at your friends through such panes as those. Other fragments were made into spectacles, and then what trouble people had trying to see through them. The wicked magician was greatly amused with all this, and he laughed until his sides ached. There are still some little splinters of this mischievous mirror flying about in the air. We shall hear more about them very soon. Part the second. A little boy and a little girl. In a large town, where there are so many houses and inhabitants that there isn't enough room for everyone to have a little garden of their own, and where most people are therefore obliged to content themselves with keeping a few plants in pots, there dwelt 2 poor children, whose garden was rather bigger than a flower pot. They were not brother and sister, but they loved each other as much as if they had been, and their parents lived in the attics of neighboring houses. The roof of one house nearly joined the other. The gutter ran along between, and in each roof there was a little window, so you could stride across the gutter from one window to another. Both sets of parents had a large wooden window box in which they grew herbs for kitchen use, and these boxes were placed in the gutter so close together that they almost touched each other. A beautiful little rose tree grew in each box. Scarlet runners entwined their long shoots over the windows and joined with the branches of the rose trees to form a flowery arch. The boxes were very high, and the children knew that they mustn't climb over them, but they were often allowed to sit on their little stools under the rose trees, and thus they passed many a delightful hour. But when winter came, there was an end to these pleasures. The windows were often quite frozen over, and then they warmed pennies on the stove, held the hot copper coins against the frozen pane, and thus made a little round peephole, behind which would sparkle a bright, gentle eye, one from each window. Let's see. The little girl is putting her hot penny on the window to melt a little hole in the ice. The little boy was called Kai. The little girl's name was Greta. In summertime they could get out of the window and jump over to each other. But in winter there were stairs to run down and stairs to run up, and sometimes the wind roared and outside the snow fell. "Those are the white bees swarming there," said the old grandmother. "Have they a queen bee?" asked the little boy, for he knew that real bees have one. "They have," said the grandmother. "She flies yonder where they swarm so thickly. She is the largest of them, and never remains upon the earth, but flies up again into the black cloud. Sometimes on a winter's night she flies through the streets of the town and breathes her frosty breath upon the windows, and they are covered with strange and beautiful forms, like trees and flowers." "Yes, I have seen them," said the children. They knew that this was true. "Can the Snow Queen come in here?" asked the little girl. "If she does," said the boy, "I will put her on the hot stove and she will melt." Have you guys seen pretty little crystals of ice sometimes forming on the windows? Well, this must be Kai looking through his window. And the grandmother stroked his hair and told him some more stories. That same evening, Kay, not Kai, little Kay. That same evening, after Kay had gone home and was half undressed, he climbed onto a chair by the window and peeped through the little round hole. Just then a few snowflakes fell outside, and one, the largest of them, remained lying on the edge of one of the flower pots. The snowflake grew bigger and bigger until at last it took the form of a lady, dressed in the finest white cape, which seemed to be composed of millions of star-like particles. She was exquisitely fair and delicate, but made entirely of ice, glittering, dazzling ice. Her eyes gleamed like two bright stars, but there was no rest or repose in them. She nodded at the window and beckoned with her hand. The little boy was frightened and jumped down from the chair. He then fancied he saw a large bird fly past the window. The next day was clear and frosty, and soon afterwards spring came. The trees and flowers budded, the swallows built their nests, the windows were opened, and the children sat once more in their little garden in the gutter, high among the rooftops. The roses bloomed beautifully that summer, and the little girl had learned a rhyme in which there was something about roses, because it reminded her of her own. So she sang it to the little boy, and then he sang it with her. Let me start that again. Our roses bloom and fade away, our infant Lord abides alay. We're going to start the song over. Our roses bloom and fade away, our infant Lord abides alway. May we be blessed his face to see, and ever little children be. That's a nice little poem. They want to stay kids forever. Do you guys want to stay kids forever, or do you want to grow up someday? All right, no pictures on this page. And the little ones held each other by the hand, kissed the roses, and looked up into the blue sky, talking away all the time. What glorious summer days were those! How delightful it was to sit under those lovely rose trees, which seemed as if they never intended to leave off blossoming. One day, Kay and Gerda were sitting, looking at their picture book full of birds and animals, when suddenly the clock on the old church tower was just striking 5, and Kay exclaimed, "Help! What is that shooting pain in my heart? And now I've got something in my eye as well." The little girl turned and looked at him. He blinked his eyes, but no, there was nothing to be seen. What do you think could be in his eyes and in his heart? "I believe it has gone," said he. But gone it was not. It was one of those glass splinters from the magic mirror, the horrid glass which made everything great and good reflected in it appear little and hateful, and which magnified everything nasty and mean. Poor Kay had also got a splinter in his heart. It would now become hard and cold like a lump of ice. He no longer felt the pain, but the splinter was there. "Why are you crying?" he asked. "You look so ugly when you cry. There's nothing the matter with me." "Ugh!" he exclaimed again. "This rose has an insect in it. And just look at this, what ugly roses they all are. And it is an ugly box they grow in." Then he kicked the box and tore off the roses. "Oh, Kay, what are you doing?" cried the little girl. But when he saw how it grieved her, he tore off another rose and jumped down through his own window, away from his once dear little Gerda. Even afterwards, when she brought out the picture book, he called it a baby's book, and when her grandmother told stories, he interrupted her with a "but," and sometimes, whenever he could manage it, he would get behind her, put on her spectacles, and speak just as she did. He did this in a very droll manner, and so people laughed at him. Very soon he could mimic everybody in the street. All that was singular and awkward about them, Kay would imitate, and his neighbors would say, "What a remarkably clever boy he is." But no, it was the glass splinter which had fallen into his eye, the glass splinter which had pierced into his heart. It was these which made him regardless of the feelings of those he wounded, and even made him tease little Gerda, who loved him so fondly. His games were now quite different from what they used to be. They were so scientific. One winter's day, when it was snowing, he came out with a large magnifying glass in his hand. And there he is. And holding out his blue coat tail, let the snowflakes fall upon it. "Now look through the glass, Gerda," he said, returning to the house. Every snowflake looked much larger and resembled a splendid flower or a star with 10 points. They were quite beautiful. "Isn't it curious?" said Kay. "These are far more interesting than real flowers, and there isn't a single blemish in them. They would be quite perfect if only they did not melt." Soon after this, Kay came in again with thick gloves on his hands, and his sledge slung across his back. He called to Gerda, "I've got permission to sledge on the big square where the other boys are playing," and away he went. Without Gerda. The boldest boys in the square used to fasten their sledges firmly to the wagons of the country people, and would be pulled a good way along the road with them. This they thought tremendous fun. That day, while Kay was playing, a big sleigh painted white passed by. In it sat a person wrapped in a rough white fur and wearing a rough white cap. When the sleigh had driven twice round the square, Kay tied his little sledge to it and was pulled along behind it. On they went faster and faster, into the next street. The person who drove the big sleigh turned round and nodded kindly to Kay, just as if they had been old acquaintances. And every time Kay was going to untie his little sledge, she turned again and nodded, as if to signify that he should stay. Kay sat still, and they passed through the gates of the town. Then the snow began to fall so thickly that the little boy could not see his own hand. But he was carried on. He tried hastily to unloose the cords and free himself from the sleigh, but it was of no use. His little sledge could not be unfastened, and glided on swift as the wind. Then he cried out as loud as he could, but no one heard him. The snow fell and the sledge flew. Every now and then it sprang up as if driving over hedges and ditches. He was very much frightened, and he would have repeated, "Our Father," which is a prayer, except he could remember nothing but the multiplication table. Here's little Kay holding his fancy sledge, which is a sled. The snowflakes seemed to grow larger and larger, till in the end they looked like great wild fowls. Then, all at once, they were swept aside, the sleigh stopped, and the person who drove it arose from the seat. Kay saw that the cap and coat were made entirely of snow. That it was a lady, tall and slender and dazzling white. It was the Snow Queen. "We have driven fast," said she, "but no one likes to be frozen. Creep under my bearskin." And she seated him in the sleigh by her side and spread her cloak around him. He felt as if he were sinking into a drift of snow. "Are you still cold?" she asked, and then she kissed his brow. Oh, her kisses were colder than ice. It went to his heart, although that was half frozen already. He thought he should die, but only for a moment, for immediately after he felt quite well, and no longer felt the intense cold around him. "My sledge! Do not forget my sledge!" He thought first of that. It was fastened to one of the white fowls which flew behind with it on its back. The Snow Queen kissed Kay again, and he completely forgot little Gerda and her grandmother and everything at home. "Now you must have no more kisses," said she, "or I will kiss you to death." Kay looked at her. She was so beautiful. A more intelligent, more lovely countenance he could not imagine. She no longer appeared to him to be made of ice, cold ice, as the time she sat outside the window and beckoned to him. In his eyes she was perfect. He felt no fear. He told her how well he could reckon in his head, even fractions, and that he knew the number of square miles of every country and the number of inhabitants of all the different towns. She smiled, and then it occurred to him that, after all, he did not yet know so very much. He looked up into the wide space, and she flew with him high up into the black cloud while the storm was raging, and the music it made seemed to Kay like the songs of olden times. They flew over woods and over lakes, over sea and over land. Beneath them, the cold wind whistled, the wolves howled, the snow glittered, and the black crow flew cawing over the plain, while above them shone the moon, clear and tranquil. Thus did Kay spend the long, long winter night. All day he slept at the feet of the Snow Queen. And we're going to stop there for now, because that was 20 minutes. But when you're ready for the next chapter, part 3, which is called The Enchanted Flower Garden, then you start the next video.